Hello everyone, welcome to Lunch with a Lawyer. I'm Steve Richardson, Richardson Law Offices, and this is my second Lunch with a Lawyer. Did one last month on New Year's resolutions and some ways of sticking to them to make your life better, a better financial future, things like that. And I don't know how I managed it. I was looking, when I was getting ready for today's program, I looked over the old last month's video, saw somehow I was wearing the same shirt. So I'm not sure how that worked out. Certainly wasn't planned, but a little bit of uniformity. Also, I kind of apologize a little bit for the lighting here. I hope you can see me okay. It's kind of gloomy in my office here in Woodbury with the rainy weather out. But let's hope you can all see me. We can have a good discussion here this afternoon. Now, as I mentioned, what we're doing is we're going to talk about student loans because we have a new president, and obviously student loans were a big issue in the campaign, and people are asking, well, what is President Trump going to do? He's talked a fair amount about student loans. Nothing is really set in stone. He's been busy signing all sorts of controversial executive orders. I won't go into that. But there's been a lot of his plate, things he's wanted to take care of. And at some point, he's going to turn his attention to student loans. There have been discussions and speeches on the campaign trail during the election last fall, where he talked about these issues, and there's stuff on the internet that has kind of looked at that and analyzed it, but we're going to talk about that today. Now, first thing, just some comments he's made and statements. One of the things we've run into, especially since 2005 when the bankruptcy laws changed, to make even private student loans difficult to discharge in bankruptcy, along with federally backed or guaranteed student loans. And we're well up over $1 trillion in national student loan debt. And I think, and it's my personal opinion of this, that a lot of it has happened because as student loans have gained this protection, that more and more banks are willing to lend this kind of money, lend more and more money. Therefore, colleges and universities have been increasing their tuition and expenses and things like that because that's what the market's bearing. That's what they're paying for. So that is an issue. And thankfully, President Trump has made some statements dealing with this situation and sort of trying to deal with student loan, financial aid and student loan debt from the other direction. In other words, if the cost of an education is lowered, then you don't have to borrow as much money or get as much in grants, and therefore can graduate with less debt. So he's made some statements like they want to push colleges to cut tuition by reducing large administrative costs, reducing federal regulations on colleges to reduce their compliance costs, so they can pass those savings along to students. And we've seen this in public education. I'm here in New Jersey, and this has been an issue with real estate taxes and the costs of education. And part of that cost is just trying to deal with, having to have the personnel to deal with the paperwork, with all this regulation that happens. Well, if you reduce regulation, the idea is you reduce costs, and therefore those savings get passed on to the students, and thus lowers the cost of attendance. He wanted universities should be required to spend all of their endowment money going forward on their students to keep tuition low and cut student loan debt, or risk losing their federal tax breaks. So President Trump has talked about this incentive to get the colleges and universities to reduce their costs. Again, reduce the cost of education, reduce the borrowing, reduce the debt. He's threatened to possible tax-exempt status for large university endowments if schools don't start making their degrees more affordable for students. So he's talked about some ways of holding their feet to the fire, holding the schools accountable for lowering costs of education. Now, he's also stated that the government should not be making money on student loans. They should not be making a profit. That's really a topic for another day. I don't necessarily agree with that for several different reasons. But what this can mean to you is that interest rates may well go down. There have been a rise where they're more tied to bond rates and things like that, where the interest rates have gone up for undergraduate loans. So if he is pushing and saying, look, we shouldn't be making money, we shouldn't have these higher interest rates, this could also lower the costs of education by lowering the interest rates, which can be good. Although I'd have to say, and we'll get into this in a minute, that interest rates are somewhat irrelevant if you end up in an income-driven repayment plan, because the payment is not driven by what your interest rate is, but by what your income is. So perhaps with a lower interest rate, lower 10-year fixed payment, people may not need income-driven plans as much as they had in the past, and therefore be able to pay off their loans in a shorter period of time, maybe 10 years. So, now, talking about repayment. Now, before I can talk about what Trump has talked about, and again, all of this is just things he said on the campaign trail, things that he said to have something to say, I guess, about this issue, because student loan debt more and more has been coming up in the media, in the news, as being a problem. Now, what we have, there are several different plans that are in place for people to repay their federal student loans. And they are, the best ones really, you either are in a 10-year fixed repayment plan, where just like a car loan or a mortgage, you're dealing with an amortized payment at the interest rate, in which you make these payments over 120 months, 10 years, and then the loan is paid off. Now, obviously, if you can afford to do that, that's the simpler plan. It's a shorter term. But not everybody's able to do that. So over the years, these income-driven repayment plans have come up. Now, speaking specifically to students, student borrowers and not parent borrowers, student borrowers for undergraduate school through the direct loan program, for the Safford loans, there's an income-driven plan called IncomeBased Repayment, or IBR. And what IBR does is it caps your monthly payment at 15% of your disposable income. Now, what's your disposable income? I don't know. It's some fancy formula that the Department of Education uses. There's a calculator on their website that can help you determine what the payment would be. But it caps it at 15% of your disposable income. And what you basically apply for it, provide income information. Usually it's the adjusted gross income figure from your previous year's tax return. You can provide other income information. For example, if you're in a different job, or you're no longer working, but you were working in the previous year, where your adjusted gross income may be no longer indicative of your income. But income, you look at the family size, you certify as to your family size, are you married, is there a spouse, children, etc. And all of that gets factored in to calculate, first of all, what your disposable income is, what 15% of that is, and then whether the 10-year fixed repayment amount is higher than 15%. If so, it gets capped. And there are many instances in which an IBR payment, it can be very low. It can be actually nothing. Your payment can be zero. Now this payment is for 12 months, and then you recertify your family size, either resubmit income information or allow the Department of Education to pull your tax return from the IRS and look at your adjusted gross income. And then recalculate the income-driven payment for the next 12 months. And this continues on and on and on till you either pay it off or you get to the end of the term. And for IBR, it's 25 years, long time, but as long as it's an affordable payment, you're fine. And if there's any balance at the end of the 25 years, it gets discharged. I'll get to the discharge in a moment because that's another issue and something that Trump has talked a little bit about, but nothing definite. So at the end of 25 years, that gets wiped out. Now, that's income-based repayment, IBR. And it can be based on your income or your combined income for you and your spouse, depending upon whether you file a joint income tax return or not. If it's joint, it's both your income. If you file separately, it is not. It's just your income. Now, that's IBR. Now, that is in the law. What President Obama did when he was in office is he, from an executive standpoint, not through the legislature, created two other income-driven repayment plans. One is called Pay As You Earn, Pay, P-A-Y-E, and the other was later became Repay, R-E, revised Pay As You Earn, R-E-P-A-Y-E. Now, what Pay As You Earn did was that was designed for students who are in school at the time that this was created. So if you had not borrowed anything prior to October 2007 and were continuing to borrow through October 2011, you qualified for this plan going forward. And what that did is instead of capping the payment at 15% of your disposable income, it capped it at 10% of your disposable income. And instead of being paid in full after 20 years, it's paid in full after 25 years. Instead of 25 years, it went to 20 years. So a shorter period of time. So obviously that was better. So you have a lower cap, so your payment could indeed be lower than it is under IBR, and you're not paying it for the maximum period of time you could pay it is 20 years instead of 25 years. But that was only for newer students. Finally, President Obama came out with Repay, revised Pay As You Earn. And that's, I've described it as sort of a good news, bad news situation for students. What Repay does is open up Pay As You Earn to everybody. Whether you were a student at the time that Pay came into place, Pay As You Earn, or not. If you had balances of student loans prior to October 1, 2007, didn't matter, you can be in Repay. And it's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is you still have the 10% cap, and if it's an undergraduate loan, it's still 20 years. Bad news is if it's a graduate school loan, like a Graduate Plus loan, it's still 25 years. So you have two different repayment periods, depending on whether you're paying your loans for undergraduate or graduate school, or professional school like medical school or law school. And also, your spouse's income has to be included, whether you file separate tax returns or not. So that can become an issue. You can't choose to file separate tax returns to try to lower your income, to try to lower your payment under Repay. And also, finally, under Pay, P-A-Y-E, Pay As You Earn, and under IBR, if your payment suddenly is less than 10% or 15% of your disposable income, then it is your 10-year fixed payment. It gets capped. So it's sort of a heads you win, tails they lose situation under IBR and Pay As You Earn, where you're making these payments and every month, and they're adjusted for your income. But if your income goes up so much that that percentage cap of your disposable income is actually higher than a 10-year fixed payment, then it's the 10-year fixed payment. and you would end up paying off the loan if you continue at that income level, and then end up obviously paying off the loan prior to the end of the 20 or 25 years. Under Repay, it's not capped. Okay, if 15% of your or 10% of your disposable income is higher than your 10-year fixed payment, then that's your payment. It's not capped. Now, good news is if that is an affordable payment, you would actually face maybe paying the loan off even sooner, in less than 10 years, but still, you're really riding a roller coaster based on your income, and your payment can go up, and you may end up just better off in a 10-year fixed plan. But that's how income-driven repayment plans work, and we have 3 different ones. All right, so let's talk about what President Trump has been talking about with regard to repayment plans. First of all, he said, and he can go through and he can get rid of pay and repay because they're not from the legislature, they're through executive action by President Obama, so that can go away. He's talking about creating one overall income-driven repayment plan. So you wouldn't really have a choice of one of these different ones depending upon your situation. If you want an income-driven repayment, you have this plan. He would talk about consolidating all of your loans into one loan payable through one income-driven repayment plan. He's talked about splitting the difference basically between the 10% cap and the 15% cap at 12.5%. And that it would be total forgiveness after 15 years for an undergraduate loan and 20 years for a graduate loan. So he's splitting the difference on the cap, so it goes up a little bit from pay and repay, but he's lowering the repayment period. So you may be paying a little bit more, but ultimately over a shorter period of time to a point where you ultimately pay it off. So he also plans to cover increased forgiveness amounts, which would be a higher cost to taxpayers due to shorter repayment terms by lowering the federal spending accordingly. Now, again, we talked about the balance being discharged at the end of the IDR period, whether that's 20 or 25 years. Whatever's left over is wiped out. So if you haven't paid down all the principal, or because of the income-driven payment, you maybe didn't pay all the interest, which is how income-driven plans can make interest rates kind of irrelevant, only to 10-year fixed plans. There's this amount left over, and that gets discharged. Now, his way of making up for that is to cut federal spending, but perhaps, if I may suggest, this is an argument for somewhat higher interest rates or the government making a profit on student loans, because maybe they aren't making as much of a profit or any kind of profit because you also have to balance the income with these loans that are getting discharged. And so they get wiped out. You come to the end and these loans get wiped out, and that's a loss of income to the federal government, and that has to be offset against any plus they may get from interest payments on people that are able to pay their loans within a 10-year period of time, or somewhere between 10 years and 20 to 25 years. So he wants to cut federal spending rather than have the government make a profit on student loans. So that's something to bear in mind. Now, the couple open questions that there still are that haven't been answered yet. Something that, as you read the news and see what's reported on this in the months to come, keep an eye out for it. There's no mention of the tax implications of the discharge. And what this means is that you get to the end of the 25 years, it gets discharged, you no longer have to pay that. So let's say you have $10,000 left over in your student loans, unpaid. You come to the end of that period, and it gets discharged. It gets wiped out. Well, the federal government, the IRS, considers that forgiven debt to be income, taxable income. So that $10,000 is considered income. It could push you into a higher tax bracket. It could expose you to some tax liability at that point. No definite decision has been made on that yet because a lot of these loans haven't gotten to the 20 or 25-year period, so it's not exactly on the front burner by Congress. But no definite statement has been made by Trump about whether he would discharge that. The other thing he hasn't talked about, and it's a biggie, is bankruptcy reform. As I mentioned at the beginning of our lunch here, the bankruptcy protection expanded to include private student loans in 2005, where the extremely high standard to discharge a government-backed student loan is now being extended to private loans. Well, there are no income-driven repayment plans in private loans. If you have federal loans, you have an option of getting into something income-driven. If you have really low income, your IDR payment may be $5, $10, or $0 or some such thing, but you don't have that option with private loans. If that protection gets taken away, then you can finally file bankruptcy and wipe out some of these crushing private loans. So he hasn't talked about that, and maybe there should be some lobbying or protesting, whatever you want to call it, to bring to President Trump's attention this problem. Now, statistically speaking, last numbers I saw were about 15% of that $1 trillion plus in student loan debt nationally is from private loans. But even so, that's a lot of money. That's over $150 billion in private student loan debt nationally. So this is something that needs to be addressed. So what do you do in the meantime? Well, if you are having difficulty making your student loans, and you're coming close to default, don't wait for President Trump to do something. Talk to the Department of Education, talk to your loan servicer, talk to a student loan attorney about getting into an income-driven plan to hopefully get people get into a plan that you can afford rather than going into default. There are ways of getting out of default, but don't put yourself through that. Get into an income-driven plan. If something changes later and you need to, maybe whatever President Trump proposes is better, or the law changes and your options may change, deal with that at that time. But don't do that. With student loan forgiveness, we still have the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Whether Trump hasn't come out with anything definite on that, on what he's going to do with that. But if you're working in the public sector full time, have or with a charity or some such thing. Hey Bill, how you doing? Thanks for joining us. I saw you were interested earlier in the program. Sorry you joined us late, but this video is going to be. Hi Dave. Dave joins us. Thank you. Dave has a daughter that's going to be going to college soon, so obviously interested in that. But if you haven't seen it, the video will be available on my Facebook page, facebook.com/Richardson Law Offices, to watch later and to get caught up. And it'll also be available on my YouTube channel at richardsonlawoffices.tv later in the week. But as I said, don't wait. Get into. We were talking about the loan forgiveness program. That's right. If you are, like I said, work for a public entity full-time, work for a 501c3 charity or qualifying non-profit full-time, and make 120 payments during that period of full-time employment with a qualified employer, you can apply to get that the balanced discharge. Now, obviously, this is only practicable if you're in an income-driven repayment plan, because a regular plan is already 10 years. But the good thing about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is any discharge of debt of the balance of the loan is not taxable. It's considered tax exempt. That's the one area where you do get a break there. So it's great for teachers, lawyers who work in the public sector for as prosecutors or public defenders, or for government agencies, things like that. It's great and something to look into. Just watch the news, see how things are going. During future lunches, I will be talking about what's going on, what's changing, what's available. If you are interested in more information on what options are currently available for student loans, I urge you to go to studentloanbook.com and download my book, I Graduated, Now What? A Guide to Dealing with Your Student Loans. All sorts of information in that. It's a free PDF download. I also, if you're applying for financial aid, like Dave will be soon, then there's another book that you can download from my website, Applying for Federal Financial Aid, the Definitive Guide. So that's it for our lunch with a lawyer. I got to get to lunch myself, and I'm sure you guys got to get back to work or grab lunch yourselves. So that's it. Like I said, you can check out the rest of the video later on Facebook or on my YouTube channel. And if you like the program, please click like, click love, keep on clicking. It helps with the search terms, and it helps with distribution of the video. So that's it, and I'll see you next month for Lunch with a Lawyer.